Welcome to my channel. Today, an art journal tutorial. This one's part of the Napkins series. Hi, I'm Karen Burchill, Creative Katie. Let's get started. So I'm starting with this Waterside Heron napkin. I've loved this napkin from the minute I purchased it, but I was stumped as to how to use it. The size was off. And as I recommend to you numerous times, just start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out some of these herons, and then I can play with them on the page and see if I can make it work. So I'm water cutting the heron out. I'm using a liner brush. I dip it in water and I run it in small portions, a little bit at a time, on the napkin after I've taken off the excess 2 layers, and I'm just very carefully, slowly taking it off. This is my preferred way of doing it. You can cut with scissors if that's your way of doing it. You do not need a lot of water. Now I just roughly do it. I've got some extra detail work in there to do as well, but I'll do that after I cut out all 4 of these herons. Now you'll notice on the napkin, 2 of them are looking one way and 2 of them are looking the other way. And I like napkins that have that, and I look for that because their usability is up, because you often want, depending on your composition, to have it looking one way or another. So here I'm taking out those little bits next to the neck. This is finer work, and I just very carefully do it and peel it back. Remember, the napkin gets very fragile when wet, but with practice, you can get all the little bits off. So I'm working on a 7x10 Canson mixed media page. I've taken it off the spiral, and now I'm playing with the herons that I've cut out. And because they're going both ways, I can arrange several on a page. One looked a little too, there was too much open page on the page and it didn't fit, but the 3 work. Now the excess part of the napkin, I'm just taking a minute here and I'm just gluing that down on another page. This is going to add some pattern and some color and get this page started. Stay tuned, I'm sure that one will get done at some point in time. So now that I have my herons each way, I decide to pull out some collage paper. And I pulled out this collage paper because it has the blue and that little bit of yellow that I'm seeing in the heron. And I'm thinking I want the heron to be either standing in water or standing on rocks. And I don't care if you think it's water or you think it's rocks. I'm being non-specific. I'm just giving the illusion of whatever the herons are standing on, and then the sky and land behind it. Adding this gel print here adds texture. I'm going to get this pattern there. And I'm just piecing it together. That's just going to add more. Just a reminder, there will be a recap of all the steps at the end of the video using my prompt and process cards. This is a little bit thicker paper, so I'm using gel medium instead of fluid medium. It just tends to work better for thicker or heavier pieces. So here we're seeing how we're taking one element for the focal image from a napkin, and then we're building the rest of my picture. Here it's going to be standing on rocks or standing in the water. I'm going to save these little bits in case I need to piece them later on. Now it was a little darker. I want the heron to stand out, so I'm putting a coat of gesso and putting this Mod Spiral stencil on top and removing the paint through the stencil. That's knocking it back, adding some more pattern. I'm just using a baby wipe that's wet. Cleaning off the gesso off the stencil. Really liking how that turned out. So there I have the blue and the yellow of the stencil, and I'm going to use those same colors to make the background. Now, I want to give the illusion that this is either sky or greenery behind the herons, or a combination of both. So I'm mixing light blue permanent and Naples yellow with gesso, with white gesso, and I'm just using the block and blend technique of blending the paint on the paper. My plan is to come back and add pattern with stencils using the blues and the yellows that I want, that I'm basically my color scheme. So once that's dry, and I'm happy of how the heron is going to stand out on the background. Of course, I want it lighter. Now I'm going to want to add some pattern. So I grab this Capricious stencil, and I'll put links in the description box with the names of these stencils in case you want to go check it out. You can purchase them. You know, some of them are at NinnysNapkins, some of them are on Amazon, some of them may be at the TCW Shopify store. So you can shop around. And I'm using kind of a blue, greenish blue. I think this is an Amsterdam paint. I want, whether this is sky, whether it's vegetation, I want some movement. And I like a good swirl pattern. This is just giving a little bit of movement to this part of my composition. It was a little too bold, so I grabbed this gauze stencil with white gesso, and I'm just going to push that back. I want to lighten it. Again, I want the herons to be the star of the show. So I'm just pushing that back. Now at the end, you don't see a whole lot of this gauze stencil, but it did the trick. It got me to the next step. And it did lighten things. And when you're working on a background, you just keep going till you get what's in your head, till it looks good, till you're happy. I use this Mum's stencil with turquoise paint, and the camera, I forgot to turn it on, so I apologize. I like the movement this made, and this kind of makes it look like there are trees in the background, the shape. It also, the shape of part of that Mum's stencil that I use reminds me of the shape of the bird. You want everything to work together. Now I'm putting the herons in their position, and I'm taking a makeup sponge with white gesso, and I'm pushing back the pattern that's going to be underneath the heron. I don't want that pattern to come through the napkin heron. If you don't want to do this, you can glue the heron onto cardstock or copy paper and then cut it out and glue that down, and that will keep it from showing what's behind it. But this works too. And I find this way easier. So I'm just positioning it. I don't want to get too much of the white on, but I do want enough so that I don't get those patterns coming through the heron. Giving this a quick dry. Now I'm ready to glue. So I position it and I flip part of it up, holding it down. Now the head, there's that long kind of feather at the back of the head, and I want to be careful not to rip it, although I'm prepared if I rip it off, I can paint it back on. And I put some of the fluid matte medium underneath and then on top. And very carefully. Remember, the napkin gets very fragile when it's wet. If you rub too hard, you will rip the napkin. Pushing that back down, doing the head, getting that position correctly, and then the body. Now you'll notice that heron, the tail is cut off. That was the end of the napkin. I'll be dealing with that later. The one I hid behind that heron, so I got right. And this one is going off the page, so you don't notice that it was a little bit short. But you can always add to whatever you're cutting out of the napkin. It's just the starting point. Now I'm just going to dry this. I had an idea here. I'm going to take that excess part of that tail and build up the tail of the heron here. And I could have done that with the part of the tail from the heron that's behind, had I thought of it. So I'm gluing that down. It's not quite long enough just yet. I'll come back to this. Now there's black on the heron, and now's the time where I want to edge the page. This frames it. It also seems to just make everything come together and point the direction of what needs to happen still. And there I'm just going to grab some dark Prussian blue and just paint off the tail. Paint up the tail. I'm not 100% happy with the background, so I'm thinking about what I can add to it, what's missing. And I'm starting to use the floating acrylic technique and shading around the herons, just to make them stand out a little more from the background. It defines where the herons are. Now, it seemed something was missing, so I think that was contrast. So I grabbed this stencil, which is fan flower. It's actually one of the cake and cookie stencils, but don't worry, you can use them for art. I do solely. And I'm adding that. This mirrors the shape of the wing, and it looks like feathers, and it gives contrast to this background that was needed. This just, in my mind, when I did this, it all came together. Now I'm taking my General's charcoal pencil and sketching around the herons, just giving it some more definition, adding some lines. Very sketchy. Now I'm adding some highlights. I've got white gesso on the brush, and I'm just adding some highlights on the body of the heron, on the head, just to brighten it up. Remember, my goal is to make the heron the focal image, most forward. So adding these little highlights really helps. In a perfect world, I would have done this before I did any charcoal. Remember, charcoal or stabilo will activate when you get it wet. So I've had to come back and apply a couple layers of the white as I picked up a little bit of the charcoal and it turned it gray. So here I'm just building up the feathers by adding highlights. And I'm picking a little bit of blue, a little bit of the light blue permanent, some of the white gesso. And painting the beak a little bit. Adding a little bit of that yellow onto the body of the heron. Now the background was a little too forward, so I'm taking some of that blue-green and making it a wash and just spreading it on the background. And it's very translucent paint, so it's not really blocking it, but it just made everything work. And so using a wash sometimes will do that. It's just enough. And I'm even doing that on either whatever, if it's a rock or the water. I'm just adding some shading to the line between the background and the rock. Let's call it a rock. I'm thinking it's the land. I'm thinking it's more land than water. I'm splattering with white, and then I do splatter with gold as well. I decided to stamp the word explore, and I stamp it with the archival ink on a piece of paper just to get the sizing so I can fit it where I want it. And here I'm stamping into the white acrylic paint and pressing down. I have a baby wipe in my hand in case I make a mistake, which I do here, and you can easily wipe it off, let it dry, and then come back and keep stamping. I am cleaning off the stamp, the acrylic paint off the stamp as soon as I'm done with the block. If anybody has a good sentiment that would have worked for this page, put it in the comments section. Now, the first E was very, very light, so I grabbed my fine line applicator bottle and I'm just making this darker. You could do this with a Posca pen or a gel pen. But this is what I had handy, so I'm just very carefully filling it in, making it more opaque. And I chose to do white instead of black because I wanted it to be more subtle. Black, I think, would have been too harsh. And there is the finished page. I am so happy with how this turned out. So I started by collaging a gel print across the bottom. And I already knew I was using this napkin. I removed paint through the stencil to get some pattern on that gel print. And the other part of the background, I applied color using the block and blend. And then I did a lot of stenciling to get the pattern and the movement in the air behind. I used the napkin as a focal image, and I cut out most of the images so I could play with composition. I put a wash of white gesso behind so the napkin wouldn't show the pattern. And then I did some shading and highlighting and sketching around with the charcoal pen. I gave a wash of blue across the whole page, minus the herons. I edged the page, and I added a sentiment by stamping with my wooden blocks. Then I splattered the whole page with white and gold. Thanks so much for joining me. Give me a comment. Give me a thumbs up. Follow me on Instagram @CreativeKatie. And until next time, go get creative.